As Paul mentioned earlier, this presentation doesn't go alongside a chapter in the Green Budget. Increasing taxes doesn't seem to be on the current government's agenda, but the government, indeed all the main parties, seem to want to open the spending taps, and in the long run, if you're going to spend more, then at some point you've got to raise more in taxes. More immediately, the Labour Party at least went into the last general election proposing quite big tax rises, and so with another general election presumably quite likely quite soon, we thought it was worth just giving a bit of background on where the UK stands on taxes and what some of the options for tax rises might be. Now, the tax burden in the UK is already pretty high by historical standards. It's around 34% of national income taken in tax, and that's expected to stay the same over the next few years. And that will be the highest sustained level of the tax take since the 1940s. But while it's high by historical standards, it's not particularly high by international standards. So the UK, the red bar here, is pretty much bang on the average of developed countries, the OECD average, the blue bar just above it. It's higher than in most of the rest of the English-speaking world, but lower than in most of Western Europe, and particularly lower than the Scandinavian economies. So one possibility might be to look at where other European countries in particular get more revenue than the UK at the moment. So where does the UK get its tax revenue from? Well, almost 2/3 of it comes just from the big three taxes, income, national insurance, and VAT. We get other big chunks from other indirect taxes on particular goods, so fuel and alcohol and so on, from corporation tax and from property taxes. Now, all major economies get the majority of their revenue from these same big three main taxes between them. So how does the UK compare to the averages of other interesting groups of countries? Well, the UK is pretty typical in how much it gets from VAT and other indirect taxes, pretty average how much it gets from corporation tax, actually gets more than most other countries from taxing property. Where the UK stands out as getting less than average is from these, particularly these light yellow bars, social security contributions, that's national insurance in the UK, and particularly the UK gets less than average from employers' national insurance contributions. Now, I think a word of caution before we think that just means, oh, we could get more like what other countries are doing just by raising national insurance contributions. A lot of other European countries, their social security system has a much stronger link between contributions and benefits, particularly pensions, also healthcare and unemployment insurance and things. And so it might not be quite a like-for-like comparison to say we would just increase national insurance contributions without also saying that we would rethink how we provide pensions and healthcare and so on. The Scandinavian economies also raise significantly more than the UK does from income tax, although other developed countries on average don't. Now, if you applied the income tax and national insurance systems from other major economies to the UK, what you would see is that they raise a bit more from they'd raise a bit more from high earners, but actually the big difference is just that they'd raise quite a lot more from middle earners. So it's not that other countries are particularly targeting high earners more than the UK is. They just levy higher tax rates on the earnings of the bulk of the population. And so one simple way that the UK could raise additional revenue, and indeed the simplest way to raise large amounts of additional revenue, would be just to raise the rates of the main taxes. And roughly speaking, you could get £6 or £7 billion from a 1 percentage point increase in any of rates of income tax, employee national insurance contributions, or the main rate of VAT. You get a bit less than that from employer national insurance contributions. You could, of course, target tax rises on more particular groups. Most obviously, you could just increase headline tax rates for higher earners. So if you just increase, say, the higher rate of income tax rather than all rates of income tax, almost all the the vast majority of the revenue from that would come from the top fifth of household, the highest income fifth. But the flip side of that is that it only raises you about a fifth of the revenue for each percentage point on the rate. Now, the Labour Party went into the last election proposing big tax rises, and part of what it wanted to do was raise income tax for even higher groups than this, those earning more than £80,000. And the Labour Party said basically that its tax rises were really going to be only affecting the top 5%. And that's broadly true of its income tax proposals, but actually its income tax proposals were only a fairly modest fraction of the total tax rises that it said it wanted. The Labour Party was proposing about 50 billion of tax rises. It said, we thought that was optimistic. We thought they'd be lucky to get 40 billion in the short run, and certainly less than that in the longer run. And so if they wanted to raise this amount, they'd have needed other tax rises as well. But that included not just increases in income tax, an excessive pay levy for the very highest earners, but also extending stamp duty on shares to a wider range of financial instruments, various anti-avoidance measures, and so on. But by far the biggest element of their proposed tax rises was an increase in corporation tax. The headline rate of corporation tax has been falling for the last 10 years, well, for the last 40 years, really. On current plans, it's due to fall from 19% now to 17% next April. Labour was proposing to increase that gradually to 26%, which would take it back to the level that it was in 2011. So to put this in international context, the UK, again, as the red bar at the moment, has one of the lowest headline corporation tax rates in the developed world. The purple bar just underneath it shows the reduction that's due to come in next year. But the purple bar nearer the top shows where it would be under Labour's 2017 plan. So still relatively low by G7 standards, but higher than average for across developed countries as a whole. But you'll notice that I said earlier that actually the UK raises about the same as a percentage of GDP from corporation tax as most other developed countries do. And one reason for that is that despite its lower headline rate, the UK has a broader base for corporation tax than most other countries, and in particular, it has less generous allowances, deductions for investment by big companies in particular than most other developed economies provide. So once you take this into account, I won't go into the details of exactly how this is calculated, but if you just look at the effective tax rate on investing a bit more in the UK, taking into account both the lower rate but also the broader base, the UK looks much more towards the middle of the table. This is just a smaller group of countries, the G7 and the old EU 15 economies. But certainly you could increase corporation tax, and that would bring in more revenue. One thing we shouldn't think is that increasing corporation tax is just a way of hitting the top 5%. It's difficult to know exactly which people are ultimately made worse off by corporation tax rises. It has to be some people in the end. Insofar as it's the company's shareholders, bear in mind that that's first and foremost pension funds of many of us. A big chunk of it, I think probably the majority, is actually passed on to workers in the form of lower wages, customers in the form of higher prices, and that really is all of us. But if you did want to focus tax rises on the well-off, and perhaps particularly those with high wealth rather than just those with high incomes, there are a number of options available. Some of those that are commonly suggested are ones that we would suggest are best avoided. These particular suggestions on the taxation of pensions, housing and wealth in general. But if you did want to go down the route of increasing taxes on the wealthy, there are other options that would be much more worth considering, including on taxation of pensions, on taxation of housing, and on taxation of wealth through, say, inheritance tax and capital gains tax. I will spare you the pleasure of going through each of these individually. I'll be more than happy to talk about why we think some of these are good ideas or better ideas, and some of them are worse ideas afterwards for anyone who's interested. But for now, just to wrap up, summarising what I've said, all the parties seem to want to open the spending taps, and ultimately, if you do want to spend more, that would require higher taxes from somewhere. We don't take a view as to whether higher spending and higher taxes are a good or a bad thing, but if you are going to increase taxes, there are more and less sensible ways to do it. It matters not just how much you raise, but how you do it. Other countries' tax systems, if anything, differ mainly in that they levy higher taxes on the earnings of middle earners, the bulk of the population. It is certainly possible to raise revenue from more targeted groups, but clearly the smaller the group it is that you try and target, the harder it is to raise really big amounts from them. But all of this is in the hypothetical world where the government was looking to increase taxes. Judging by what the Prime Minister has been saying, it seems that tax cuts are more on the agenda at the moment. And so for now, I will hand over to Xiao Wei to talk about what those might involve.